So I was thinking this last week. What are the psychological ramifications of an infinite being born into a finite experience? What might be the psychological makeup of an infinite being finding himself or herself in a finite body? You know, I would think it would be something like feeling limited, feeling kind of confined, restricted, feeling maybe flawed, like not enough, because we come from infinite presence. Maybe isolated and disconnected, separate. So the Judeo-Christian story of the first people on the planet, our original parents, kind of underscores this idea. So they lived in paradise, had this experience of God just walking around with them, and then they screwed up. They ate the apple, they screwed up. God finds out that they messed up. He kicks them out. He separates himself from them, and then they live a life of hardship. And in Catholicism, when I grew up, that was called original sin. And we all partook in original sin. We all, you know, before we even had a chance to do a sin, we already had a sin on our souls. It was the sin of Adam and Eve being separate from God. And in the Protestant tradition, it kind of came out with the idea of that the flesh and the earth, that it's sinful, that somehow it's not of God, that it's separate from God, that God is somewhere in the skies or somewhere in the distance judging us because we're separate and somehow need to be judged because we're gonna screw up. So whether or not you grew up with these stories are clearly in our culture. They're in the Western civilization culture. This idea that we're separate from God, that we will be judged, and that we need to be judged, that somehow we've screwed up, that we don't quite measure up. So last week I got a text from a family member who I love very much, and I got the text, and I felt like the text I got was kind of blowing me off. It's kind of blowing me off. And you know, albeit texts and emails don't convey the whole story. Sometimes we misread them. But in this text, I went to the lowest common denominator. This person who I love was blowing me off. And it brought up all this stuff in me about being the illusion of being separate and somehow not quite measuring up. So it's the story of the infinite being born in the finite condition, having those psychological kind of ramifications. It's a story of Adam and Eve being banished from our good, being banished and separated from God. About a week after I got this text, I talked to this person, my family member who sent me the text, and I had totally misinterpreted the text, totally misinterpreted. And I thought, isn't that interesting that I went to the lowest common denominator in the interpretation of it? How many times do we gather evidence that supports that we're alone, that we're isolated, that we're cut off, that somehow we don't quite measure up?